Hello and welcome to the Hormones in Harmony podcast. I'm your host, Vivian Allred, naturopathic nutritional therapist and hormone enthusiast. If you want to learn how to rebalance your female hormones, regulate your menstrual cycle and reclaim your vitality, then you are in the right place. Each week I will be delving into different conditions such as PCOS, endometriosis, infertility, hypothyroidism, acne and hair loss. Stay tuned for interviews with expert guests, Q&As and solo episodes that are all intended to help you move from hormonal chaos to hormonal harmony. If you'd like to submit a question for me to answer on the podcast, then you can email them to hormonesinharmony@gmail.com. The information shared on this podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not designed to replace the advice of your health practitioner. That said, let's get into today's episode. Hello, welcome back to episode number 13 of the podcast. Today I'm joined by naturopath Kate Powe and we're talking all things endometriosis. Kate has a passion for helping women reclaim their health and creates a happy and empowered life. Kate has a personal experience with endometriosis and this instigated a shift from an established corporate career to naturopathic medicine, where she now educates and supports women through their own health journeys, integrating evidence-based medicine with mind-body principles. She runs her own online clinic, helping women all across the globe with their cycles and hormone health, with a particular focus on endometriosis, PCOS and peri-menopause. In this episode we discuss what endometriosis actually is, including the common signs and symptoms. We dive into the common causes and drivers of this condition, why it isn't just a hormone imbalance, the role that gut health can play with the pathogenesis of endometriosis, the role of endocrine disrupting chemicals and environmental toxins, and the differences between conventional and a more holistic approach to treatment, including nutrition, lifestyle, supplement and herb recommendations. This episode is really jam-packed with information, so if this is an area of interest to you, I'd recommend taking notes. Kate is a wealth of knowledge and really is an expert in her field, and I really think that you're going to enjoy this episode, so let's get into it. So hi Kate, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. Why don't you start off by telling us a bit about who you are, how you got into kind of the nutrition world and specifically women's health?
Yeah, okay, and thanks for having me, Vivian. It's great to be here and sharing info with your audience, which is fantastic. So my name's Kate. I'm a naturopath in Sydney, Australia, and I basically got into women's health because I suffered endometriosis myself throughout my life, and it wasn't detected till I was sort of in my mid-30s, so I'd kind of struggled a long way through my corporate career, and I worked for sort of investment banking and software and, in quite corporate worlds. And this unnamed kind of disease was really plaguing me, and it wasn't till I sort of got into my 30s that I found out what it was, and I became really curious as to what can I do to help heal it, because there didn't seem to be much information from that perspective offered, at that time. So I did a couple of things. I left my corporate career then and I moved away from home for a little while. And I then decided when I came back to study naturopathy and to really focus on women's hormonal health and endometriosis in particular. And it's just been a really interesting journey. I think we're going through such a scientific, well of information at the moment. And so it's come a long way, and we've still got a long way to go, but it's a really interesting space to be in and to help educate other women about, this sort of unnamed and hidden disease that's been like that for so long. So, yeah.
Yeah, and with endometriosis in particular, it feels like there's new research coming out every single week, which is amazing. And I feel like it's just been kind of unknown for so long that it's a really good thing that there's more interest and more seen in the kind of wellness world these days as well. It's more diagnosed, and even though it's not a great condition, there's so much that we can do to improve it. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think more than anything, it's just knowledge is power, even if we still don't have the answers and we don't have a solution and we don't, but even the effect of just women understanding they're not making it up, and that it's not just they're not coping with period pain like everybody else is, so they're not good enough. Just knowing that it's a real thing, it exists, and that in itself is just getting people to talk about it and women to open up about it, and not only for the women but for their families and their partners and the workplace. And there's so many other ramifications, I think, of this condition that before was sort of had to be so hidden because people just thought it's period pain, but now we can talk about it like a real chronic, genetically sort of driven condition, which it should be, I guess, held up for. Yeah.
Absolutely. So for those who are listening and they've maybe heard of endometriosis before, but they're not quite sure what it is and they're not sure if it's something that they're dealing with, will you just go over what it is and the common signs and symptoms?
Yeah, sure. So basically, endometriosis is the presence, I guess, of endometrial-like tissue. So that's the tissue that's found within your uterus that you have a period. It's found external to the uterus, so it's in the pelvic cavity. And that tissue, I guess, responds just like your endometrial lining responds every month to the fluctuation of hormones. So just like when you have a period, that tissue also responds to the drop in hormones and bleeds, but because it's in that pelvic cavity, it's got nowhere to go. So then that causes sort of adhesions potentially to other organs. So it can then cause scar tissue and pain, and that's one of the sources of, we'll talk about some of the symptoms, but some of the symptoms can be quite significant pain, and that's often because organs become attached to each other, and this scar tissue and high inflammation sort of occurs. So that's what it is, I guess. Some of the other, I guess, facts around, if you know anything about endo, you've probably heard a lot of facts thrown around about, there's 1 in 10 women suffer from it, which is quite a conservative estimate, really, because I think more and more people are just being diagnosed with it. And it's based, or it's staged on diagnosed, I guess, on a couple of stages. So it's classified as 1 to 4. So a stage 1 is quite a small amount of endometriosis found. Stage 4 is significant endometriosis found. But the one thing to note about it is that the staging, whether it's 1, 2, 3, or 4, isn't based on how severe the symptoms are. So you can have stage 1 and have enormous array of symptoms, or you may have stage 4 and really have no signs or symptoms, no pain, not much at all. So it does get difficult. It's not an easy thing to diagnose, because it's not, these are the 5 sets of symptoms and voila, you have endo. It can be a tricky kind of disease. But some of the symptoms, I guess, that you'd be looking out for, pain is a big one. So as I said, it doesn't happen in every case, but it is if you're experiencing really significant pain. So some of the pain that some women talk about with endo is, quite substantial. They might be having nausea and vomiting. They might be not being able to stand upright or on the bathroom floor, or not being able to get out of bed because they're in so much pain. It can cause flooding, so very heavy periods. There might be spotting or bleeding throughout the period. Bloating is another really common symptom. So often we can mistake that for sort of IBS symptoms or SIBO, if some people know about that, where, there's gut disturbance and bacterial overgrowth that can cause bloating. And sometimes that can be a really key sign of endo. And then there's also other symptoms around it. There may be infertility, there may be depression and anxiety and mood swings, huge amounts of fatigue with the amount of inflammation going on. So there's some of the things that can help you come to the conclusion that maybe endo is part of the picture.
Mm-hmm. And just a couple of questions about that. There may not be definitive answers, but when you were saying about the endometrial lining growing in other areas of like the pelvic cavity, what happens to the blood that should be shed? Does that just become like the tissues and adhesions?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And with the stages and the severity of pain, when you mentioned that you could have stage 1, but it could be like crippling and really severe, is there any reasons for that? Is it for people who have maybe, not to sound like dismissive, but a lower pain threshold, or is it just the level of inflammation that that's causing?
Yeah, I think it is really, I mean, I'm sure the, different pain thresholds will be part of it at some point, but no, really it is, it also is around the amount of cytokines that your immune response will create these inflammatory cytokines when there's tissue that's shouldn't be where it's, where it is.
Yeah.
And some people just, their inflammatory cascade may not be as high as others. So it really just depends on not only that level of pain tolerance and the level of inflammation that those lesions are causing, but there's also a couple of different places or severity of the endo as well. So it can be quite superficial. It can be just based on the ovaries, so it might just be ovarian endo, or it can be this deep infiltrating endometriosis. So it's kind of phased into those 3 categories. And often the deep infiltrating endometriosis is the one that's a lot more severe and usually causes more pain. And that can also be put down to, like I said, what organs it's attaching to. So if there's significant, say, colorectal involvement, so attached to the bowel, the large bowel, then every time you have a bowel movement or, go to the bathroom, or it might be attached to the bladder, and the same thing will happen when you urinate, that those organs and the nerves and fibers around those will be stimulated. So that will cause more severe pain. So it really depends on the placement, the amount of lesions, the amount of scar tissue, and then your own biology, I guess.
And would you say that symptoms are usually in a cyclical pattern, so from ovulation leading up to the menstrual cycle, or in some cases, is it month-long that people are dealing with some of these symptoms?
Yeah, it really can be quite random, and it can be either. So often a key sign, if it is just happening at the period, is the pain will get worse on bleed. So you may still have common signs and symptoms, which a lot of women do, of sort of PMS. So that week in the lead up might be, a bit of bloating or a bit of back pain. But often endometriosis women will find when their period pain starts, it gets significantly worse. Whereas usually in just PMS, symptoms will completely, die down once the period starts. And just linking that symptom onto another related issue, I won't go into it too much, but there's another related issue to endometriosis called adenomyosis, which is basically that endometrial tissue, instead of being in the pelvic cavity, it goes into the uterine muscle wall. So it goes inwards rather than outwards. And that's another key sign of sort of adeno, because when you're having a period, your uterus contracts. So it's when there's endometrial tissue within that uterine wall that can cause significant pain when you start bleeding. So that can be another sort of little sign of that. But yes, getting back to your other question as well, it can be throughout the cycle, because basically any time, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but estrogen, can stimulate some of the pain and inflammation that goes on with those lesions. And obviously throughout your cycle, you have different peaks and troughs of estrogen. So that can also be part of that inflammatory process throughout the whole cycle.
With adenomyosis, do you tend to see that and endo go together? And what about other hormonal conditions too, like PCOS, hypothyroidism? Do women with endometriosis have a higher prevalence of these things as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a kind of link with a crossover. Like there's no causative or, absolute definites, but there is associations and links with other autoimmune conditions, especially things like Hashimoto's and celiac. So the celiac gene is a big one actually for a lot of these conditions, to sort of have shared haplotypes or genetic kind of links with each other. With adeno, it's less diagnosed. Often it's said to be more prevalent in older women, so women sort of over the age of 40, for example. But I I wonder if that's really just, it's not diagnosed. You know, we're only really coming into terms with endometriosis, so I don't think people are on board yet with adenomyosis either. But they do commonly. I think the stat is around 20 to 30% of endo women will also have adenomyosis. And yeah, so and definitely with PCOS, they can be concomitant or happen together as well. And a good point to raise about that is that often I'll see women come in that have been diagnosed with PCOS, and they may have PCOS, but they'll be talking about this terrible pain that they're getting. And I think it's really important to note that PCOS doesn't cause pain. So if you're experiencing severe pain and PCOS, it's still worth looking into the potential for endometriosis.
Yeah, I say that all the time too. And definitely could just be due to inflammation, or like we mentioned about the gut health thing. Women with PCOS may have a gut issue, or they could kind of have all three of those things, but definitely pain isn't included in the diagnosis criteria or really the symptomatic picture in women with PCOS. That's a really important differentiation.
Yes.
Would the treatment of adenomyosis be similar to endo, just as a guide for other people?
Yeah, it is. I mean, look, there's really not a lot known about adeno. You know, still they can't even confirm whether it is actually endometriosis that is just within the myometrium or the muscle wall of the uterus, or whether it is an actual separate condition. So we do treat it, I guess, similarly. It acts like endo, so I guess I follow the same sort of treatment protocols around it as well.
Yeah, maybe in the next 10 years we'll have some more research on that condition. Fingers crossed. So all that being said about endometriosis, I know that there's not a one definitive root cause of this. What are some of the driving factors or possible causes of endometriosis?
It's a really good question, because you know there's a couple of theories, but yeah, we've not come up with one sort of etiology of the cause yet. But I think that the shift in understanding around it has really changed from it being, you know, a hormonal condition to actually a disease of inflammation and a disordered immune function. So where we used to think, you know, it was all about estrogen and that's all anyone sort of focused on, and that's what a lot of medical treatments will focus on, is actually hormonal management, which is one arm, I guess. But we talk about it that it's really an estrogen dependent condition, but it's not the cause. So one of the theories they're looking at is actually this idea around like a bacterial contamination hypothesis. So what that means is talking about certain endotoxins from gram-negative bacteria called lipopolysaccharides from either the gut or from the menstrual fluid, so pelvic cavity basically, end up in the peritoneal fluid. So and they think that this contamination of these bacteria then just drive inflammation. They lower natural killer cell activity. So that means the, you know, white blood cells, not your white blood cells, but your immune system is basically, doesn't detect sort of endometrial lesions that might be there. So usually your immune system would detect foreign tissue and remove it. Like that's what your immune system does. But in this case, the radar of the immune system is off. So it allows then this sort of attachment and growth and virulence of endometriosis. That's one theory behind it. There's also genetic links. So there's been several genes that have been linked to a higher rate of endometriosis. So often if you've run a genetic panel at some point, you can pick some of these genes and just see if you have a propensity for it. There's a familial link along with that. So there's about a 7 to 9 times increased risk if your mother or sister has had endometriosis. And that's hard to detect sometimes too, because I guess, you know, from generations up, even people's parents or mothers may not have ever been diagnosed with endo. They might have just had trouble periods or heavy periods, or no one really talked about it back then. So it's interesting to sort of quiz your family members if they've had any period troubles when they were older, when they were younger. Sorry. So yeah.
With the genetic link, does that mean if your parents or your grandmother, if there's a strong family history of endometriosis, does that mean that it's something that you're going to be dealing with too? Or does epigenetics play a factor with this condition as well?
I always think epigenetics plays a factor. So I always think your diet and your lifestyle and the environment that you're in will play a role for better or worse. I think the unfortunate thing with the epigenetic side of it is that we tend to be born, into a more and more toxic incarnation in world as we go. So there is, some people may be able to negate some of the genetics. I think our world is just making it that much harder. Our detoxification processes are under more strain because we have molds and synthetic, estrogens and just a whole pile of toxic sort of waste that we may not have dealt with hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So, and I think we have to admit that while we can make changes with, as we said, diet and lifestyle and everything else, it can be such a hardwired disease that I think it's not a simple fix, and it's not something we can necessarily, for every woman, correct with, a organic diet. It is something that I think is bigger than that, and I think your genetics and just the chronicity of the disease can be quite a challenge for women. So I'm all for using all methods to help whatever suits the woman, whether that's medical, natural, mind, body, mental, everything else. So.
Mm-hmm. And we're not really being set up for success, are we, from the minute that we're born? It's kind of, we're just being exposed to so many things. And I do definitely want to go deeper into the environmental link later on. When you were saying that it's more of an inflammatory immune condition rather than a hormonal condition, why is it that it can lead to hormonal symptoms then and conditions like infertility? Is it just because the lesions and the growths are kind of affecting the ovaries and maybe causing damage to the pelvic organs, or is it there's other mechanisms behind that too?
Yeah, there are a couple of mechanisms, and there is still a hormonal component, definitely. So the growth and the severity, I guess, is definitely linked to estrogen. So estrogen plays a part in the more that estrogen stimulates the endometrial lesions, the more they will grow, and they develop their own blood supply as well, so they can be quite tricky little things to get rid of, which is why sometimes, and we haven't talked about treatment, but just removing it may not be enough, and that's why common medical treatment is hormonal suppression, because it does progress and promote the disease, I guess. And as to the question with infertility, there can be a number of reasons. So it might be exactly the presence of them can impede implantation, for example. That could be one cause. If the endometriosis is on the ovary, it can affect, if you're looking at IVF, for example, whether the egg retrieval process, if there's surgery on that endometrial lesion, it can cause damage to the ovary, which would reduce fertility further, which is something to be considered when looking at those sorts of things. But also the presence of endometriosis itself will instigate this inflammatory process. And it has been shown that actually endometriosis on its own without surgery will decrease some of those fertility markers that we look for, like anti-Müllerian hormone, FSH. So it does impede egg quality and quantity to some extent. Now, that doesn't mean that there's always infertility with endometriosis. Definitely not. But it can impact on a number of different levels, whether it's placement, whether it's some of those inflammatory cytokines can make the endometrial lining difficult for implantation, for example. So it may it's got sort of far-reaching impacts on fertility, for example, and how it plays out is different for every woman.
And is this a condition where it gets better when you age? So when you're maybe in menopause, your estrogen levels have dropped, will you experience less symptoms, or have you still got the kind of chronic inflammation going on if you don't really do anything about it?
So endo, if it's not treated or if it grows back or whatever, is always there. So definitely symptoms tend to, for the majority of women, decrease after menopause or disappear after menopause because there isn't that constant estrogen stimulation. But it would be wrong to say it disappears and that some women won't continue, because obviously as women we still have different levels of estrogen through our body, even postmenopausal. So from your fat cells, etc., you will make certain levels of estrogen. So you've always got some estrogen in your body. And for some women, this will still cause them issues. But generally speaking, yes, just like if a lot of women get a little bit of relief or a lot of relief from medication that stops that hormonal surge and shuts down the hormonal, your HPA axis and your ability to ovulate, it will improve symptoms often through menopause once you don't have that constant ovulation and estrogen going.
Yeah, it's just, I think it's kind of similar with PCOS. Now that you've not got the massive levels of androgens present that you would in your 20s and 30s, some symptoms can improve, can't they? Like the hirsutism and acne. A lot of people find that they can conceive later in the 30s now that they've not got that androgen kind of halting ovulation, but other things can develop because of the chronic insulin resistance and chronic inflammation. It makes you more prone to cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes. So the symptom pattern can shift, but it can just be kind of putting you at risk of other chronic conditions as well at the same time.
Exactly. And you're right, for both of them, I think it's a lifelong challenge to really work on inflammation within the body. And there's lots of ways and means of doing that, but it's not enough just to focus on, the hormonal aspect. I think there's a bigger picture behind it, which for both conditions, absolutely, it's about inflammation and
And do you think it's something that can be reversed or kind of put into remission? Say someone had the some of the endometrial tissue removed, or they had some of the adhesions removed from a laparoscopy, and they change their diet, they support the hormones, support inflammation. Is it something that can kind of not grow back, or is there always some degree of relapse that occurs?
That really depends on the woman. So again, it's not something we can sort of say this blanket case happens for everyone. For some women, they may not even need a laparoscopy. So for some women, if it's not severe or if their symptoms aren't severe, the change in diet and lifestyle and even the diet may be different for different women. So there's not even a one, solution fits all, but that can be enough. So really, really that can be massive for them, just to reduce inflammation, take out some of those key drivers, help the immune system. That can definitely solve a lot of women's problems. For other women, it might be they get a significant decrease in symptoms, but this symptomatic picture may not go away unless they have further involvement, whether that's surgery, whether that's medication, whether that's natural sort of medicine, whatever works for them. So it really depends on the severity and what symptoms they're actually experiencing.
So in some cases, if it was quite mild, could diet and lifestyle, maybe supplements alone, help to reduce some of that endometrial growth?
Yeah, definitely. So we know even with some of the supplements that we use naturally, there can be a big impact on the growth and the virulence of the endometrial tissue. So if there's not a lot of it, if it's not a severe case, if there's not a lot of pelvic organ distortion from adhesions and that sort of thing, so if it is quite a mild case, then absolutely we can make huge inroads where, as I said, you don't even need surgery. So
And that's really inspiring for a lot of women. They probably just think that they're stuck with this condition, like they have all of this inflammation and damage to the pelvic organs, but they've not been told that there is ways to either maybe reverse the growth or even suppress it a little bit so it's not as kind of stimulated and it's not as inflamed as it was. So I think that's a really helpful comment, that it can definitely be improved from diet and lifestyle alone, but obviously there's the people who do need further support, even from conventional approaches too.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
And what about chocolate cysts? So could you explain what they are and kind of what's going on with that? How is that different from the conventional growths that can occur?
Yeah, so chocolate cysts or endometriomas are basically endometriosis of the ovary. So it just means, and they're called chocolate cysts because they contain sort of blood and fluid, which makes it look chocolate. So it's like a chocolate cyst. And that's exactly, it's still a form of endometriosis. It's just affecting the ovarian function. So that can cause, sometimes women may experience more pain at ovulation, for example, with those cysts, because as they grow, they, cause that sort of that pain attached to the ovary. So that can be another determining factor, I guess, sometimes in trying to pinpoint if it's endo and where that endo might be located. There's obviously diagnostic ways to look for that, but yeah, it's just another form of endometriosis. Yeah.
And also bleeding ovulation, that can be an indication too.
Yeah. Which absolutely, bleeding ovulation, that can also occur depending on if there's just something else to add to that, that there's lots of reasons why that may occur as well. So it's a good idea to be referred and to have further investigations, because that may be things like polyps or fibroids or other things as well. So it may not just be endo, but there's key signs that, bleeding at ovulation could be something like an endometrioma. Yeah.
Let's talk a bit more about the estrogen aspect. So we've talked about how it kind of exacerbates the endometriosis, but it's not the root cause and shouldn't be the only thing that we focus on. Can you just go into what estrogen dominance is and maybe some other common signs and symptoms of that and why it's so prevalent these days?
Yeah, well, and it's a term that I don't usually use, estrogen dominance, but I look at it more like a relative excess of estrogen compared to progesterone. So it's not necessarily that, I have too much estrogen. It's really what's happening to progesterone. And that can be because you're not ovulating. So there's an over prevalence of estrogen and you're not making any progesterone. It could be, which is quite common in endo women, a genetic link, which I was talking about before. There's a progesterone gene. And if you have a genetic SNP or a fault in this gene, it can just mean that your body's not very receptive to the progesterone that it's making. So again, estrogen symptoms will be more prevalent than balancing out with progesterone. Estrogen is really important for us. Like, we love estrogen. It's good for your bone and heart health and metabolic health and fat burning and all the rest of it. But its role, I guess, is proliferative. So it likes to build and grow, and it grows the endometrial tissue and the lining within the uterus. And then therefore, if there's endometriosis present, it will grow that as well. And progesterone acts as its opponent, really. So it likes to put the brakes on and, temper estrogen's kind of force. So I guess it's when there's too much estrogen, when we think about it, it will build that endometrial lining, for example. So some of the common signs and symptoms of that will be very heavy periods, long periods, long bleeds. And I think it's really prevalent at the moment also because, as I said, this whole toxic impact on society is that we're exposed to xenoestrogens, which are sort of synthetic estrogens, I guess, from our environment. And that's causing a lot of women to get their periods earlier. So we're exposed to estrogen for a longer period of time throughout our reproductive life. And this can cause some of these hormonal conditions going forward. So this overabundance, I guess, of estrogen. And the other thing about estrogen is that it has this curious relationship with histamine. So as estrogen rises, so does histamine, and as histamine rises, so does estrogen. And histamine is part of our immune system. It's great, but it can be quite inflammatory to the body as well. So you often see these people with higher estrogen having heavy periods, painful periods, a lot of PMS symptoms and mood swings and that sort of thing. But they can also have this link with allergies and, hay fever and gut symptoms, headaches, migraines, a whole pile of other things that are linked with high histamine because of this overabundance of estrogen.
Yeah, and I'm so into the research with histamine overload because I have a histamine intolerance myself, and absolutely at ovulation, that's when my symptoms are the worst. I can't tolerate the higher histamine foods like avocados, chocolates. It'll break me out, it'll give me anxiety, and then again, within the couple of days leading up to my period, I'll get itchy skin, I'll feel really tired, I'll feel anxiety, palpitations again. So it is in that cyclic nature as well. Let's talk a bit more about the role of environmental toxins. So where are some of these places that we're going to be finding them in our environment? So we mentioned about the xenobiotics. Where are these found?
So pretty much everywhere. We can't get rid of them. Unfortunately, we're living in a world surrounded by them. So look, common places of these xenoestrogens, especially from plastics, and even we talk about now, there's certain plastics that are free of these sorts of things, but they're just rife. So pretty much in I'm just trying to think, things like your household cleaners, toxic makeup products,
skincare is a big one.
Skincare is massive because clearly you're putting it on one of your largest organs in the body, and that will be absorbed. And so I always think things like microwaves and microwaving in plastic or Glad wrap or any of those sorts of things will really impact on those level of the toxicity from the plastics that we get through our system. And also basic things like I don't know what they're called, but the thermal receipts. So the covering on those thermo receipts. And they're everywhere. Like, how do you stop? How do you stop? It sounds really stupid, but you're like, don't touch them and put them away.
Absolutely. I worked in retail for many years, and I had to handle the receipts on a daily basis, and I'd literally pinch the receipt, try not to touch it. You see people putting it in the mouth, so I'm like, no, don't do it.
It's horrible. So I think any of those little things we can make it's great. Like, don't touch your receipts, but switch to things like your clean household products, and there are so many beautiful makeup sites and organic skincare brands out there now which have really come a long way. So I think there's no excuse to not be investigating that, and women today are pretty good at that. The older generation might not be, but the younger women are definitely really concerned about toxic chemicals that they're putting on their skin or bathing in or washing their hair with, or so that's a good shift that I think most people are pretty au fait with at the moment. So.
Yeah, I agree. 5-10 years ago, you couldn't really find any effective products. It'd just be like coconut oil and those types of things, but there's so many green beauty brands these days. Obviously there is the issue with greenwashing and brands claiming that they're organic and natural, but they're actually not. So I like to recommend the Think Dirty app by the Environmental Working Group for anyone listening. You can scan your products, you can search them online, and it'll give you a toxicity rating, and then you can find the best brands to go for. And they are really effective, sometimes even more so than the conventional ones, and obviously you're not getting the negative effects of the endocrine disrupting chemicals in there too. What about heavy metals and pesticides? Have they got as much research in endometriosis as the plastics, or is plastic the biggest one to avoid?
I think just anything that's putting a toxic load that is increasing that estrogen. Like I said, it's the plastics and that sort of thing are really increasing the estrogen side of things. But for me, it's you know, endo women also have a bit of a, or anyone with estrogen, higher estrogen symptoms can have a difficulty in their detoxification processes. So it's not only about the load from the environment, but also their natural ability to be able to cope with the load. So wherever you can minimize, you know, risk from environmental toxins, that's great. But sometimes you just can't. I mean, so, you know, our food that's just now covered and, you know, like you were saying before, even some of our foods that are claiming to be wild farmed or, you know, natural are just not. We can't guarantee that. So it comes back to us to keep our body, I guess, as healthy, and as our liver to support things like liver health and gut health, because without the ability to detoxify, then we're just going to, you know, increase that load. So that's where I think those looking after your liver health, looking after your gut health especially, which is the hot topic of the moment and the root cause of, you know, so many issues, I guess, it's really important. And we're learning more and more about that gut health and how specific we need to be with certain, you know, strains of probiotics or prebiotics, or getting a diversity as well. So yeah, looking after your own internal system, I think, is the best way. And then just obviously making sure whatever's environmentally affecting you is clear, whether that's dust, whether that's molds, whether that's plastics and, yeah, chemicals and the rest of it. So, yeah.
Definitely. I think we just need to do the best that we can and control maybe what we're exposed to in our homes. That's going to be the best way to go about it, because we just can't avoid the exhaust fumes and the chemicals in the environment when we're outside of our home. They're just so prevalent. So maybe just do the best that you can. Make sure you're using the natural skincare, the cleaning products, and controlling what you can. And people usually make the argument that your liver doesn't need support. You don't need to support detox. It knows how to do it, but it does. But sometimes it doesn't have the resources, and there's just so much kind of chemicals and crap coming in that it just gets overloaded and sluggish because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. You know, I'd agree with that. The liver, that's its whole role, is to detox. Like, that's what it's born for. So, you know, it's not like we have to do detoxes 24/7, but definitely it comes a time where we need to support it, and we need to not fill it with rubbish, you know, additionally than the stuff that we're already just getting environmentally. And as I said, we are born into a different generation where I think this planet's load is getting higher and heavier, and you know, we're being asked to our bodies to work pretty hard to keep things moving. So, and that's why I think we are seeing sort of, you know, prevalence of these inflammatory type conditions as well. So
definitely. Organic food was just the norm 100 years ago. Now it's woo-woo and really weird if you buy organic. Just ridiculous.
And just something else you brought up before, which I think is really important to mention as well, do the best you can. Like, the other thing that I think we need to be really clear and is not to get obsessive about, you know, being perfect, because I think that's quite a key trait in some endo women. There seems to be, this is just anecdotal, but there does seem to be a bit of a type A, you know, wanting to this perfection and to be right, you know. And I really think in treating endometriosis, part of it in that mental emotional state is to let yourself off the hook, that, you know, to not feel guilty that you've got it or that it's your fault, and that you can't be perfect. You just have to do the best you can. And otherwise you're going to be worried about what you can eat and what you can't eat and what you can, you know, all the rest of it. Whereas do the best you can, eat a really clean diet where you can, eat whole foods. And that's, you know, enough. Like, don't stress yourself out too much about it. So, yeah.
Absolutely, because that stress is just going to make your symptoms 10 times worse.
Totally.
So you mentioned gut health again. So we've spoken about the role of lipotoxins and endotoxin on certain bacteria that can exacerbate the immune system and create a lot of inflammation. Do women necessarily have to have digestive issues to have this going on inside the gut?
No, there may not be any digestive issues as such. As I mentioned, it is a key sign, though. We talk about one of the symptoms that endo women get is this endo belly. So it's this classic sign of, you might wake up with a flat stomach, and by the end of the day, you look 6 months pregnant, and that's, you know, what people talk about. It's like I just bloated, I'm just, you know, blew up. And that can be just from this, obviously from gut health and bacterial toxicity, but you may not. So that may not be part of your picture for endo. The other thing to remember though is, unsurprisingly, endometriosis can have high rates of anxiety and depression and mood, mental and emotional symptoms. Now, obviously, if you're in a lot of pain, and that's going to be enough to cause you to be quite down and depressed. But there is definitely a link with higher anxiety, higher depression, and that can be stemming from the gut as well. So it may not be physical symptoms of, you know, diarrhea, constipation, bloating. It may be more mental, emotional symptoms, which are also coming from that serotonin, you know, production in the gut, which is lowered, and that will affect your mood, obviously. So
yeah. And before we go on to the natural treatments and recommendations that people can start to implement, what's the conventional approach to endometriosis? Is it the birth control pill and just see you back here when you want to go through IVF or go on a fertility drug? What's kind of the go-to treatment plan?
Yeah, there's a couple. So usually it starts, you know, most women are put on some form of the pill, or that's usually what you know, step one. And that may be for endometriosis. It may just be period pain or irregular periods, and without question, they're just put on the pill. So often we'll find that, and it's only when they come off the pill and experience this excruciating pain that we go, oh, maybe you've had endometriosis this whole time and no one's recognized it or you know, seen to it. So usually it starts, some women, it will just start with that. If it is significant and you're really getting investigated for endometriosis, it will start with a pelvic and a transvaginal ultrasound, so basically an external and an internal ultrasound, and that can detect potentially the chocolate cysts or endometriosis on the ovaries. It can, in some instances, detect potential endo, but it's definitely not diagnostic of endometriosis. So you may be lucky, and it may detect other conditions as well. Like you might be able to see, you know, fibroids or polyps or other things that are causing some of your signs and symptoms. So it can be good for differential diagnoses. There's also a more targeted ultrasound now for this deep infiltrating endometriosis. So again, it's not definitive, but it can be useful without surgery to see if there is detectable endometriosis via that way. But the gold standard is really a surgical procedure, which is a keyhole surgery, which is the laparoscopy. And that's basically, you know, they'll go in with a little light tube kind of thing to detect through the belly button. There's a small incision. They'll go in, it's under general anaesthetic, to see around that pelvic cavity and see what they can see visually. And it's also the treatment. So if they find it, they will usually remove it then and there. So unfortunately, it's not an easy, I'll just go off to the doctor and see if you've got endometriosis. Be nice. There is, you know, both in the States and the UK, a blood test which is trying to be developed at the moment, but that's probably a few years away yet.
Yes.
But that would be nice. If we got a blood test, it'd be a lot easier than having to send people for surgery to really be sure.
Absolutely. And that's where kind of conventional medicine shines, with the surgeries, with things like the blood tests. That's where we're really appreciative of, like in the UK, the National Health Service and just conventional medicine. That's where that can really be effective. But for the chronic conditions like hormone disorders, digestive issues, I think that's where functional medicine and nutrition really shines.
Absolutely. And we have our own little flags in functional medicine. Again, there's no definitive diagnosis from it, but you will notice things on blood tests that will tweak you to think, oh, this could be part of endo. So there's a specific cancer marker, CA125, definitely not always raised, and it doesn't mean that you have cancer. It can just be a sign, if it is raised, that that's endometriosis presence. Other things like we'll talk about histamine, I'll look for histamine levels, I'll look for other autoimmune, you know, markers or antibodies potentially. there's some, we can run cytokine panels now, which show the level of interleukins and tumor necrosis factor and a couple of these cytokine markers that, if they're raised, can be another tweak. And then genetic panels. There's a couple of things that we can look at for just that. If a couple of them, all the ducks line up, you sort of help you to head towards that sort of conclusion as well.
And would they change your protocol and plan of action in any way, or would you still just be focusing on the inflammation, the immune dysregulation, and the estrogen component?
Yeah, I think it's helpful more from a differential diagnosis, I guess, from if someone's coming in and saying they've got really bad period pain, if they've got some bloods with them, it's a good checklist to go, oh, hang on, if that was tested and your estrogen looks at, pretty high on day 2 to 3 when it should be quite low, or they've got high histamine, or they've got a high white cell count, you sort of be going, okay, like that's probably not just PMS. There looks to be a more systemic inflammatory process going on, and that's when you might dive down a little bit further into the endo sort of questionnaire, and then may refer then to a doctor to actually get some ultrasounds and some further testing done around that.
Yeah, and let's say we now want to talk about the kind of naturopathic approach to endometriosis. So say someone came to you eating a pretty healthy diet, but they're dealing with endometriosis. What would be your first go-to steps?
It really depends on what their outcome wants to be. So for some women, it's their, fertility is number one, but for other women, it's their mental emotional health is through the floor, and that's where we need to start even before we look at the endo. So I think it's a really good idea to have a broad palette to play from, but to really question the woman. Is it pain and severity of symptoms? Is it mood swings? Is it fertility? Like, what's her driving force to deal with this? But and there's a load of things we can talk about in all of that, but from, I guess, a dietary perspective is always a really good place to start, because it's something that's, cost effective, and most women can sort of start pretty easily with looking at. The first thing I'd say, though, is to be quite mindful of restricted eating, which is what I was sort of alluding to before as well, that often there is a bit of a perfectionist streak, or women with who are trying to be really healthy, who are trying to follow really good, organic, healthy guidelines, but by doing that can become a little bit obsessive and a little bit over-restrictive of food. And so I think it's really important to make sure, especially from that sort of microbiome perspective and from your gut health perspective, which is driving this immune process, we need a broad range of foods in our diet. Like that is what increases our microbiome and, really supports the good bacteria in our guts. And if we become very restrictive, so does our microbiome, and that affects everything. So I think it's just important to put a caveat around that healthy doesn't mean being uber restrictive. But generally an endo diet will be more of a plant-based diet, and there's evidence behind a lower red meat, component in that. And with respect to anyone vegan, vegetarian out there, I'm a bit of a fan of a small amount of animal protein in people's diets, especially in something like endo or higher estrogen, where they're losing a lot of blood. There may be potential anemic, low protein, low zinc in these women. So I think a little bit of good quality organic red meat, if you eat meat, is okay still. But generally plant-based is the way to go. You want lots of things like cruciferous vegetables, which are your Brussels sprouts and broccoli and cabbage and kale and cauliflower and all those sorts of things, to help with estrogen modulation and to help the liver process. And there's good evidence too behind dairy-free and gluten-free. And I don't like to take all women off dairy and gluten just for the sake of it, because I think, again, that can be a little bit overkill sometimes. And some women don't have an issue with that. But there's definitely science behind, from a gluten-free perspective, there's been studies where over a 12-month period of a gluten-free diet, there was, in this particular study, 75% of women reported reduced pain only 25% reduced no improvement, and there was 0% of worsening of symptoms. So just with that, what we're talking about earlier with this crossover link often with other autoimmune conditions, it does seem to share a little bit of a pattern with other autoimmune conditions. And we know that gluten and the celiac gene in particular is also correlative with that. So it can be a good idea, I guess, just to give yourself, I always trial it. I just say, look, if we haven't tested for celiac, for example, just see how you go off it for a couple of months, and does your inflammation, pain, etc. help? Do you feel better? Are your moods better? Are your bowels better? Is the pain level better? And the same with dairy. So, and usually with dairy, it's more about the protein in the milk rather than the lactose or the sugar. So it's to do with the A1 casein protein that women seem to have particularly inflammatory response to. And a good, I guess, way to test that, or a factor, is often if if as a child you suffered a lot of sort of ear, nose and throat issues, or tonsillitis, or that sort of thing, that can often indicate a bit of a dairy intolerance. So they're the sorts of women that I would suggest going dairy free for the same reason, and just see if inflammation comes down. Yeah, and then there's other evidence from diet between a low FODMAP diet as well, especially with SIBO women, so with this small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, that can help, which is a very low carbohydrate diet. So it's not a diet to follow for any length of period. I'm not a fan of super restrictive diets for a long period of time, but for a period of 4 to 6 weeks, that can be trialed. Or a favourite diet that I usually use with women if there's symptoms, as we talked about before with histamine, is a low histamine diet for the same reason, just for a short period of time, do a bit of gut healing, but taking the histamine load off your system is a really good idea, and often is really efficacious. Yeah.
And the histamine-rich foods are some of like the healthiest foods that we're all told about for gut health: fermented foods, bone broth, avocados, leftover foods, but they could definitely be driving the symptoms.
Yeah, and that's the hard thing, because everyone says, "Oh, I'm really healthy. I'm eating a really healthy diet," and it's just heartbreaking then to go, "I'm really sorry, but you're going to have to stop eating and switch it into something else." It's devastating. So yeah.
Yeah, that's what happened to me at the start of my health journey. I found about fermented foods, kombucha, and I was just every single day chugging kombucha, brewing my own, and my scalp was on fire. It was itching, my acne was raging, and I just thought it was like a detox reaction. So I just carried on, and then I finally realised.
Yeah, that's it. That's absolutely it. Yeah, they'll be like, "But I'm having all this kombucha," and you're like, "Yeah, no, stop."
And obviously everyone's different, so it's maybe worth a trial on the histamine restriction, the low FODMAP if someone's got SIBO, and then again, gluten and dairy, try eliminating it at least for 30 to 60 days, and then reintroducing always organic with both of those things, just to reduce the toxic exposure as well. But what are your thoughts on other diet like the AIP diet and paleo, where they restrict further foods like grains? How do you feel about those things?
Yeah, I'm not a massive fan. I'm definitely less of a fan of those restrictive foods. I think they've all got a place for the right person, and certain people will respond well to certain diets. And I think that's also to do with your genetic makeup, your ApoE status, your ability to tolerate fat and processed fat. So I think some people obviously do really well on keto, for example. But my overall opinion is, when you restrict, say, carbohydrate or fat, or go overboard with fat in the opposite direction, that can again really impact your microbiome and really impact the nature of the bacteria in your gut, which will impact levels of inflammation. So and especially on a very low carbohydrate diet, we need carbohydrate for a whole pile of reasons. And for your ovarian function, for your thyroid function, it converts your T4 to T3. We need carbohydrate, and we need it for energy and everything else. So from a hormonal perspective, I think we can't it's really difficult when there's so many different diets out there that people are trying to follow to do the best that they can, and getting lots of mixed messages. So I'm a big fan of taking out the known inflammatory foods, which is often the gluten and the dairy, for that short period of time and monitor. But you still need to be including things like carbohydrate in whole food. So your starchy carbs, your root vegetables, you know, it doesn't have to be breads and pastas, but it can be whole foods that you're getting carbohydrate from. And the other thing is, we need resistant starch, again, for our gut bacteria, and that can come from, you know, things like less ripe or greener bananas or cooked and cooled potatoes. So you're still getting the starchy carbohydrate, but it's not impacting your fructose levels and sugar levels and all that sort of thing. So it changes the way that starch behaves in our body, and it's really beneficial for the gut. And then we still have that carbohydrate for all the other processes in the body that we need as women. So
And if someone's reacting to things like grains, resistant starch, cruciferous vegetables, then that's just a sign to work on gut health first, and then reintroduce them to benefit the gut microbiome. What would be your approach for someone who maybe has PCOS and endometriosis and has maybe severe insulin resistance in that case? Would you work on the PCOS first, or the endometriosis and inflammation first?
Yeah, and that's tricky. That's horrible. I hate the people that I don't hate the people, but I feel so bad for those people. I'm like, oh, you've got the double whammy. It's not a pleasant state to be in. And I guess it comes back to inflammation. And so I would take out the work, at least. I guess for me, that the insulin's really such a strong driver, and I'd really want to work on lowering sugar. But by saying that, that doesn't mean cutting all carbohydrate out still. So PCOS women still need carbohydrate, still need whole food carbohydrate. What we're trying to do with them especially is just take out the processed sugar and the high fructose. So, you know, dried fruits, they can still have whole fruit, you know, 1 or 2 pieces. There's evidence around that can really help insulin levels, but we want to remove the really concentrated forms of sugar, for example. And just doing that is going to take off a massive inflammation load, and that's going to help the endometriosis as well. So it's all about the type of carbohydrate that they're eating, not saying can't have any carbohydrate.
And all of the other things too that support insulin resistance, like sleep, exercise. It's not necessarily always the carbs. What is the connection between maybe some other lifestyle factors in endometriosis, like exercise and sleep? Are they beneficial, or is there something that maybe with exercise that you should limit in some ways, different types of exercise?
Yeah, so again, looking at it from a weight management perspective, that can be important for some women. Now, not all women obviously have weight issues with endometriosis, but if they do, estrone can be increased in these women. So that's when I guess your adipose tissue carries, it allows the aromatization, I guess, of one of your androgens, androstenedione, into estrone, which is one of the forms of estrogen. So by reducing excess body weight in those women that may be a little bit overweight, that can help lower that estrogenic load. And then from an exercise perspective, you know, cardio and sweating is good because obviously that helps your detoxification process, so that's good. But in endo, it can be really common to cause what they call endo flares. So it can, you know, exacerbate the pain and some of the symptoms of endometriosis. So again, I think it's what works for the woman. Some women love running because that's their meditation and it works for them, and that's great. For other women, we might need to go really gently and slowly. So it might be more those low impact, just getting out for a walk, getting some sunshine, you know, negative ions from water if you're around it. Swimming can be a good low impact exercise. Things like strength and conditioning can be useful because that can really empower women too and make them feel quite good and confident in themselves without overstimulating their systems and causing pain. So it's really dependent on where the woman's at and what works for her, really.
Great. And we've covered the nutrition, we've covered the lifestyle, environmental toxins. So once someone has addressed all of those things, that's when we usually look into supplements, herbs, botanicals. Are there any particular nutrients or herbs that you really love and can be really effective in women with endometriosis?
Yeah, so I have my favorites. Again, I think it's always useful, if someone's really suffering mood and that sort of thing, then we work with that as well. But from the purely endometriosis side, I think there's some supplements that can really, really help both with pain and with the growth and stimulation of the endometriosis. So probably my top two, I guess, would be turmeric. So a really high dose curcumin supplement. It's a really good liver detoxifier. It's analgesic, so it helps with pain, and it also helps stop the implants from implanting by stopping that endometrial growth or that stimulation of those lesions. So it does that by blocking estrogen's impacts on its growth. So it's really good at inducing cellular death as well, apoptosis. So it stops the growth, it stops the stimulation, but it also stops the growth. And then it stops, I mentioned before, these lesions have their own blood supply. So curcumin actually inhibits the ability for the blood supply to get into them. So again, it shrinks and stops the overgrowth of them. And it also works on inflammation as well. So, yeah.
And for that reason, that's why it's not recommended for women trying to conceive. Am I right with that? In high doses, it can kind of affect implantation like it would with the endometrial tissue. I'm kind of usually wary about using a lot of turmeric in that situation.
Yeah, that's probably right. I don't actually know about that, but it doesn't suit anyone. The warnings are it doesn't suit anyone. It doesn't suit everyone. The warnings around it especially are definitely not if you are going in for any surgery or potentially procedures like that. It does increase risk of bleeding. So you want to be cautious about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And N-acetylcysteine, or NAC, is another one that has some a little bit of research behind it. It also has some significant impacts on painful periods, so the pain side and the chronicity of pelvic pain. It's the study that was done, it actually showed that it reduced the size of endometriomas on the ovary, and that a certain number of women had their surgeries cancelled because the cysts had either reduced so much or the women had got pregnant, whereas before there was infertility. So and it also works. I really like N-acetylcysteine because it's so far-reaching. So not only does it help with the actual or potentially reducing those the endometriosis invasion, but it's used a lot for mood, for anxiety, depression, for any kind of addictive behavior, which I find is kind of, again, a little bit of a link in some endo women. It's often quite interesting to find that a lot of endo women have a history of eating disorder or mental or emotional or sexual abuse as well. So that can set them up for certain patterns as they go through. And I think NAC has such far-reaching impacts to be able to help on mental, emotional, as well as physical levels. It's a really good go-to. And it's also a fantastic antioxidant. So it helps that glutathione. It's the precursor to glutathione, which is your master antioxidant in the body. So again, from that inflammation perspective, it's a really useful amino acid to have in there.
Yeah, I agree with that. And especially for the women with the horrible combination of PCOS and endo, it can really help with insulin resistance and liver detoxification too. So I find that that's a really helpful nutrient. I definitely love NAC.
Yeah, it's a good one. It's a good one. Everyone should be on NAC. Not everyone, no.
Disclaimer.
there are contraindications. And then the other one, I guess there's a few others around, but zinc I think is really important too for women, just from a immune perspective, from an oxidative stress perspective. It reduces inflammation. It helps with gut and mood and ovarian function. And yeah, again, I think it's so low in so many women, and especially if they're following a diet which we're saying is good, like a more plant-based diet. A high plant-based diet is actually usually a high copper diet, and that opposes zinc. So usually we find zinc levels are quite low in women in general. So I think zinc is always a really good idea just to have in there.
Mm-hmm. And then the other ones, obviously it's best to do some sort of testing first to see if it is suitable for your particular case. Things like DIM, indole 3 carbinol, do you tend to find that they work quite effectively?
I generally don't use them so much in endometriosis, to be honest. So definitely in cases of PCOS or high estrogens from other conditions, but they're not my go-tos, unless sometimes I would use, if we know it's a very estrogen dominant woman. I do like things like calcium D-glucarate, for example, which can work not only on liver, so it helps reduce estrogen itself, but it actually inhibits an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase, which it's an enzyme in the gut, which once your estrogen's bound up and on its way out, it can hit the gut, and with this enzyme, beta-glucuronidase, can break down that bond, which means that there's free-floating estrogen in your system again, and then that estrogen can be reabsorbed and sit back on the little estrogen receptor, and then increase your estrogen load all over again. So I find that calcium D-glucarate can be a really good useful supplement for women with high estrogen. It makes sure we're clearing that estrogen out. But yes, I would always test for anything else. I mean, zinc, I usually test for zinc as well, but I'm fairly confident, lower doses are fairly well tolerated by women because it's not stored particularly well. But for any other mineral nutrient deficiency, where if we're looking at iron, for example, we definitely want to test it before we give things like that, or B12 or any of those sort of other things.
Mm-hmm.
Would be testing before doing that.
Yeah, that's really important. And what are your other go-to tools to lower that estrogen level? So apart from changing the diet, increasing fibre, and avoiding endocrine disrupting chemicals, adding in the calcium D-glucarate, are there any other tools that you use to, if someone's just really high in estrogen, maybe they're not even overweight, so they're of normal weight, they just have raging estrogen levels, how would you handle that one?
Yeah, look, I think in that case, if it is specific, those sort of specific things, then things like, DIM can be useful. I also focus more on, I keep getting back to gut health, but fibers. So things like partially hydrolyzed guar gum or acacia gum, any, more foods, obviously high fiber foods, but those brassica family vegetables, the cruciferous vegetables again. So they're the sorts of things that are going to bind up the estrogen and help them move out of your system. Really focusing, I guess, is the elimination pathway. So we're not only just wanting to lower estrogen by a supplement or diet, but we're needing to make sure that that estrogen is getting out of the system and not sitting, and you're not having constipation or not having a bowel motion for 2 or 3 days. That's not good. So then I look at things like hydration, upping fiber content, upping those green veggies, moving your body. So peristalsis is happening. So from that perspective, that's how I'd lower estrogen. And then I'd look to things like potentially DIM, but calcium D-glucarate from that perspective. And then for some women, look, if we, they may need hormonal support. So this is when, for certain women, I will look to working with a medical practitioner and looking at things like a natural progesterone or micronized progesterone. So if there's obviously we're trying to get ovulation to happen as well. So if there's any ovulation issues, they're not making their own progesterone, then we would work towards that. But for some women, working with some micronized progesterone in that luteal phase of their cycle, or the last 2 weeks of the cycle, can really help with pain, inflammation, anxiety especially. So progesterone is really important in managing mood and working with GABA in the brain, your calming neurotransmitter. It helps you sleep, and it opposes, as we said before, that estrogen dominance. So that can be really effective for some women that just need actual hormones.
Yeah, really great information. And I do want to start to wrap this up because I know how busy you are and I don't want to keep you much longer. There are just a few questions that I want to ask, maybe some more personal questions just so we can get to know you a little bit better. The first one would be, what's your number one favourite herb, nutrient or supplements? I know that we've touched on a few endometriosis specific ones, but are there any that you particularly love?
Oh, there's too many. I'm such a herb nerd. I love my herbs.
Me too.
They're like my witch's brews. I love them. I think my favorite, probably have two favorites. One's Eleutherococcus, which is Siberian ginseng. I just love it because it's great when you're feeling just fatigued. It's a really good adaptogen, so it helps your adrenals. It helps just, and especially if you're convalescing, it's a really nice herb for that. If you're feeling, we're so used to pushing, you know, often we don't give ourselves time to convalesce and to take a break. So I find it's a really nice, nurturing herb. And I think my other favourite, there's too many to talk about. I love kava. So kava's another one, and there's some questions around liver, but I think for anxiety and for just mellowing out, I think kava's beautiful, and it's you can use it very low dose. I often use it in more of a energetic dose even, or a homeopathic dose for clients, and they all report just amazing results on that. So yeah, that'd be two of my favorites anyway.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't usually tend to get many herbs, especially those two herbs. It's usually just magnesium or vitamin C. So I'm glad that we've covered some different ingredients and nutrients, people that can look into that. Second question is, what did you have for breakfast this morning, or what's one of your go-to breakfasts? Just to give people some maybe ideas of healthy breakfast, because it's usually one of the meals that people struggle most with.
Yeah, and it is hard. I'm not a early morning breakfast person at all. So usually I'm eating breakfast a little bit later, like around 10 or 11. But I like just keeping it really simple. So I will often do a smoothie. Because I can put all my bits and pieces in there, and then I know I've got a really good start to the day. And I add things like, I do weird things like freeze zucchini and chop it up into pieces, freeze it.
And cauliflower, that works.
It's great because it thickens it up, and it's like, makes it cold, but you're not putting fruit and more, you know, and fructose in there. And I put things which I like chia seeds, flax seeds, this guar gum, or any fibers. So I use a partially hydrolyzed guar gum, but it's a great way to get fiber, to get, you know, protein, to get a whole pile of things in there. Frozen green banana again for that good resistant starch, and it's not high fructose. So yeah, usually I'll do that with I don't know, I usually use like a half coconut and water, or just water, or rice or almond milk or something like that. Or I might have a really good quality piece of, you know, buckwheat toast with, you know, goat's feta, for example, or something like that. I like sort of really that salty, yummy, and it's got some good olive oil in there. And yeah, that's probably occasional eggs. I can't always have eggs, but yeah, I think they're a really good staple for people who tolerate them well.
Yeah.
Not all people do, but yeah, good source of complete protein and a whole pile of other things, choline and everything else. So, yeah.
Third question is, what's your biggest piece of advice for someone currently struggling with endometriosis? So kind of taking into account everything that we've talked about, what would be the one piece of advice that you'd give?
I think I would say, don't feel guilty. Like, I think it's one of the biggest pieces of advice is it's not your fault, and that you're not a failure for having endometriosis. And it's not a failure to seek medical advice either. And that the best you can do for yourself is to cut yourself some slack, because most endo women have been dealing with a lot of pain, mental, emotional pain, as well as physical pain, under the surface, and haven't been able to share it. And I think just to give yourself some slack, and to take help, ask a lot of questions, take help from wherever you can, to make an informed decision about the best way forward for you. And for some women, that may have to be the pill or the Mirena or surgery. And there's no shame about that. Like, if that's the best way to manage this for you, then that's great. And there's always something we can do from a natural perspective to help support you on your journey.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Love that advice. You can definitely implement that into any condition, whether it's PCOS, endometriosis, IBS. We shouldn't always kind of demonize conventional medicine. It serves a purpose, and we shouldn't be ashamed if we do have to take medication, or in terms of thyroid issues, people who are on thyroid medication, your body needs that hormone. It can't create hormone when your thyroid gland's damaged. So a lot of people do find shame and they're guilty about certain things like that. But yeah, I love that advice, not to be kind of ashamed or guilty when you have to turn to medication or surgical procedures.
It's a chronic condition, and you need help from wherever you can get it. So.
Yeah, exactly. Get all the help that you can. So final question is, where can people find you online and connect with you?
Okay, so they can find me at my website, which is at katepowe.com, katepowe.com. I'm also on Facebook, Kate Powe Natural Medicine, and Instagram, same handle. So you can find me there.
Yeah, and you're always providing great resources. You've got some great blog posts and a free guide on your website too that everyone should go and check out. And yeah, you're just a wealth of knowledge. I want to thank you so much for your time today. I know I've kept you a little bit longer than we planned, but yeah, I think it's just been a really informative episode. Everyone's going to really benefit from this. And again, if they've got any further questions or they want to work with you one-on-one, then definitely recommend it. Head over to your website and they can connect with you there.
Thank you, Vivian. It's been a great pleasure to share with your listeners. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Hormones in Harmony podcast. If you like this episode, please leave me a rating and review, as this helps to spread the word to other women dealing with hormone imbalances. As a massive thank you gift, I'll send you a free guide, 6 Steps to Hormonal Harmony. All you need to do is screenshot your rating and review, then email it to me at hormonesinharmony@gmail.com, and I'll send you the link to download this free guide. If you haven't already, check out my website vivanaturalhealth.co.uk and Instagram page at Viva Natural Health for tons more free content and inspiration. You can also schedule a free 30-minute hormone troubleshooting call to find out the next steps to take in order to overcome your symptoms naturally. See you back here next week for another episode.